fellow YouTubers. But I'm only going to say this once. The haters on YouTube are on the verge of flooding with hate comments. We have been kept sleeping within our own clouds for far too long. We must wake up. We must fight back.
Damn, that's a dangerous dude right there. Radio Free Innsmouth episode 234, part 3 of Ari Hankonen.
It's over, Johnny. It's over!
Nothing is over!
Wait, what?
私のパズル完成しました。
We're out of Ari Hankonen projects to talk about. That's not good. I needed something to alternate with the final part about Gargoyle next week. What have I been listening to lately? Probably a lot of doom metal, but not like... type stuff. No, we're talking about, I guess you could call it fast doom metal. But it's way too early in the year to cover something like Witchfinder General. That's for Halloween or something. And I already talked about Pentagram. I guess I could remake that episode, but I don't know, man. And that's what I've been thinking about all week. What the hell am I going to do this week? And then it came to me.
Use the Force, butthead.
What?
Use the Force.
We'll do an episode about Force, the band that essentially gave birth to Iron Man, one of my favorite bands of all time that I covered back on episode 188. So that's what we're going to do. Now, there's a whole lot of doom metal bands out there, even when it comes to the underappreciated styles like the sort of faster paced but not stoner kind of old school doom metal. And honestly, Iron Man is about tied for first place in my estimation with Witchfinder General and Pentagram, and above Trouble and even Candlemass, at least for me.
That's just like your opinion, man.
And it's kind of hard to explain why, because on the surface, this isn't really super unique stuff, but the more you listen to it, the more you realize that Alfred Morris III had a really unique guitar playing style, and that extends back to his days with the band Force. The best way to describe it would be to say that most of this style of doom metal's guitar playing is predicated on vertical development on the fretboard. For example, one of my favorite doom metal bands of all time that I covered back on episode 138, Gates of Slumber. They had this amazing song called Riders of Doom, and it's like a textbook doom metal riff. It does have one little tricky part right here, that bar chord bit. But basically the root note of every chord is played all on one string, except for this part right here, that note. It's entirely based on vertical motion moving up and down the neck on one string, apart from that one string jump. That's what I mean by vertical motion. And it's like that for a lot of doom metal. Like, you can move across the strings, but there's not a whole lot of riffs that absolutely necessitate doing so. There's not a lot of horizontal motion. Now, there are exceptions, notably from Tony Iommi from Black Sabbath, specifically on a lot of the riffs that he wrote in the 80s. Like the song Glory Ride off the Eternal Idol album. This was a kind of a tricky riff for me to figure out how to play on my own. Specifically, this weird sliding part right here. Until I realized you have to use at least 3 different strings for your root notes to pull that off. And that's what gives it that wide, expansive, epic sound. Out of all of the bands I can think of that play this style of old school doom metal, Iron Man uses that sort of horizontal motion more than like any other guitarist. And Al Morris has been doing that since before Iron Man even existed, way back in the late 70s and early 80s when he had this other band called Force. You'll get songs like this one that start out with pretty standard Sabbath tribute style doom metal, albeit released much earlier than most other bands that did this sort of thing, so ahead of its time in that regard. But then he starts running all over the neck with riffs like this. Shit's like Brain Drill, but instead of tech death, it's traditional doom metal. And there's cool wah pedal, of course, but that's really what makes Al Morris stand out as a guitarist for me, is he has this very unique way of incorporating all of these flourishes and utilizing that horizontal motion to its advantage, just do a whole bunch of cool shit on the guitar. But that sort of stuff isn't the only reason that Force is a pretty unique doom metal band. To get into what else is so special about the band Force, we're gonna have to go back, way back.
Back into time when the only people that existed were troglodytes.
Also known as 1980, the year when Force began shopping their demo around to labels. Vocalist for Force at this time was one Simona Queen. She doesn't sound too out of the ordinary when she does these kind of more mournful doom metal vocals, but when the music starts to pick up a bit, her performance gets a bit more unique. I also really love the guitar tone in this album. It's very cold and washed out. Reminds me a lot of the second St. Vitus album, which also had one of my favorite guitar sounds. But when the music picks up a bit, Simona starts doing this sort of R&B thing. Very different for doom metal or metal in general, and honestly, I love it. According to the booklet of my copy of the Force Discography, much of this album was written specifically with just Alfred jamming guitar riffs out in a room and then Simona writing vocal parts specifically to complement them. And it really shows in how well all of the vocal arrangements are so integrated with Al Morris's rather idiosyncratic method of writing guitar riffs. And much like Black Sabbath, the band that Force is undoubtedly the most influenced by, despite being a doom metal band, the music isn't all just gloom and doom either. Often when the music picks up during the happier riffs, it almost kind of takes on this proto-punk kind of aesthetic, which is very interesting and rather unexpected. Listen to that loud-ass 70s cowbell. Here's an interesting sort of blues rock riff that has a surprisingly morbid sort of finish to it right here, with the way he really hammers on the final note of the riff. Made even more impactful because of the higher degree of horizontal motion that I described earlier. I mean, maybe for some of you, this might be a little bit too happy for heavy metal, but I don't know, my favorite band right now is Aphasia, so I'm all over this kind of stuff. Here's another interesting guitar technique, where he starts really leaning into the rock and roll aspect of this music by adding a little bit of bluesy variation to the riff. It actually sounds a whole lot like what Motorhead were doing around the same time, but in like a doom metal context.
You may ask yourself,
why haven't I ever heard of Force before? This seems like some really important early doom metal. The answer to that is that their discography is a little bit complicated. They have the 1980 demo, they have a full-length album that was released in 1991, and then they have a split album that came out in 1994 with the bands Obstination and Asylum, both of which were actually early versions of the famous doom metal band Unorthodox. And yet, if you were to look at the cover of your copy of the Force Discography, which should be around here somewhere. Where'd I put that friggin' thing? No. There it is. But yes, on that album's sable sleeve, it says in nice big red letters, Force Discography 1981 to 1984.
What is going on here?
Well, it turns out the packaging of the album is actually correct, and all of this material was recorded during that early 80s period. It's just that the full-length album, it's really more like a demo, and that was what was released as the Force LP in 1991. The 1980 demo wasn't released at all until this compilation came out, at least as far as the general public goes. And then their tracks on that doom metal split I mentioned earlier, where the band wasn't even actually called Force on that CD, that says Rat Salad, that was all shit that was like added after the fact. When that material was being recorded, it was actually a Force demo. And Al Morris was so impressed with the sound of the female vocals on the earlier Force material that after Simona Queen left the band, he got another woman to come in and do vocals as her replacement, one Sherry Blade, who was actually in a relationship with Bobby Leibling from Pentagram during the 80s.
No shit.
Given that this is the final material from Force and the one closest chronologically to what would become Iron Man, it makes sense that this sounds more like Iron Man than the rest of the Force stuff. Specifically, I'm talking about that horizontal movement of the 80s gradually turning into the sort of subtle and gradual expansion of chords by adding more and more tones over the course of a riff that would come to dominate Al Morris's guitar playing in the 90s, which is what you're hearing right now. In terms of vocal arrangements, though, it's definitely very much a continuation of the kind of stuff they were doing with the earlier Force demos, where the vocals are very much in lockstep step with the guitars rhythmically and tonically. They kind of play off each other and sort of do this weird harmonizing thing you're hearing right now. Production on this album is very similar to the sound they would have on the Iron Man debut. Thick and bassy and not as fuzzy as the Force material of the earlier 80s. Song structures, however, are much more complex and Iron Man-like, as you're hearing with this cool counterpoint riff right now, kind of playing off that initial set of riffs with a clever reversal. And with that very Iron Man-esque guitar solo, we are ready to close out our examination of the Force back catalog. As I intimated earlier, there's not too much material in it. About an hour and some 10 minutes of music overall. That doesn't really make for a full, fulfilling episode of RFI, so why don't we just completely bookend the Iron Man episode. We started out with Force, the protonymic version of Iron Man. Let's see what happened to Iron Man after they broke up due to the untimely passing of Al Morris. So if you have listened to the Iron Man episode of RFI, you probably remember there were two major new aspects to the band that were introduced on their last album that really sort of made Iron Man into a very unique band even compared to their earlier material. The first of these was the new vocalist Screaming D. Calhoun. He also became the lyricist. Now, there's nothing really wrong with any of the earlier Iron Man vocalists / lyricists. Rob Levy on the first Iron Man album, very much sort of like a streetwise lyricist dealing with a lot of everyday concerns.
Smoke my fucking cigarette.
Dan Michalak and Joe Donnelly were a little bit more mystical and spiritual in their outlook on stuff.
I use my satanic powers to help people, man.
D. Calhoun, however, is literally actually a published author, and he's even done some voiceover work for the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, so it follows that his lyrics are much more literary and border on philosophical, but more importantly, his actual vocals are fucking intense. He's probably the most Dio-like of anybody associated with Iron Man or Force. Not necessarily in how his vocals sound, although he is quite a bit gruffer than most of the other vocalists, but rather in what the vocals are doing against the music. Specifically, he tends to sing across the guitar melodies more than with them, and kind of introduces his own melodic component to the music, leading to a greater increase in overall contrapuntal complexity. The other major new component of latter-day Iron Man sound would have to be the bass playing of Louis Strawn, who actually joined Iron Man in 2006, but I think his work really sticks out on the final Iron Man album more than the others, due to how that album is produced. Now again, there's nothing wrong with the bass playing in earlier Iron Man material. It's just that most of that was much more standard metal kind of stuff, where the bass was more just kind of there to really back up the guitar. But when Louis shows up, he takes a much more dominant role in the music, playing his own counter melodies off of Al's guitar riffs. And luckily the final Iron Man album is produced in such a way for that to be very audible. But what's interesting about both these guys is that these aren't like new people that Al went out and found. These guys were both established musicians before they joined Iron Man, so I thought it might be kind of interesting to see what these two guys were up to prior to their joining Iron Man. So both of them had been in a whole bunch of different bands prior to being an Iron Man. I figure I'll just grab one for each. So D. Calhoun, back in the late 80s and early 90s, was in this band called Phantasm, and what's wacky about these guys is that they aren't a doom metal band at all. They're more like sort of a technical, progressive, kind of power metal, thrash metal type of band. Whole lot of time changes, whole lot of weird riffs, odd dissonant passages like this one. Almost kind of Watchtower adjacent, but substantially darker. And yet, they still do kind of fit in with that sort of Maryland doom metal scene of the early 90s, because their music is just so darn morbid sounding, and all of the weird complexities of it aren't that far removed from what you might hear in a band like Revelation or Unorthodox. Also, Dee's vocals are still very abrasive and powerful, but they don't really have that doom metal low-pitched monster characteristic they would take on when he joined Iron Man. They're much more, maybe not quite power metal sounding, but definitely more 80s sounding. So overall, Phantasm, very interesting band. For Louis Strawn, when it comes to his earlier output, I'm going to go with the band Life Beyond. Who are definitely much more Iron Man sounding with their doom metal, albeit still a little weird, especially when they do stuff like this guitar part right here. Lots of very dissonant chords being utilized, and the songs are labyrinthine in construction. Whole lot of riffs in each one, despite the shorter song lengths than average for doom metal. Whole lot of like weird bendy shit going on, and that would definitely become a major part of later Iron Man. So you take those two guys and hook them up with Mott Waldman and Al Morris, you get my favorite Iron Man album. But like I said, Iron Man ended up breaking up after Al Morris died. What a lot of people may not be aware of is that everybody else that was in Iron Man started another band called Spiral Grave. I mentioned them on my Iron Man episode, but I hadn't actually listened to them yet at the time. I've since actually gone out and gotten the first Spiral Grave album, which came out last year, and it's honestly an interesting synthesis of Louis Strawn's and Dee Calhoun's priors. And it's really good stuff. One of my favorite albums that came out last year, in fact. That usage of natural harmonics in the main riff of the song like that very much seems like something that wouldn't be too out of place on a Life Beyond album. It's just that it's way more morbid sounding here. It's also kind of an upbeat album. Almost not even really that much of a doom metal one. More just like a heavy metal one. Maybe even a power metal one at times. Which could possibly be some of that Phantasm stuff sneaking in. This song in particular is pretty cool because it's sort of a lyrical prequel to the song Thy Brother's Keeper off of the final Iron Man album, which told the second half of H.P. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror. This song, Nightmare on May Eve, tells the first half of the story. And it's got a whole lot of weird riff changes, which was definitely a thing in both Life Beyond and Phantasm. This riff right here is sort of like a weird hybrid of some kind of groovy doom metal riff and a thrash break, and it ends up leading into a whole nother crazy segment of riffs. This sort of foreboding, ascending guitar figure, which makes sense both musically and narratively in the context of where the story's at. So that's Spiral Grave in a nutshell. Really great new band made up by people who were important parts of really great old bands. And it all stems back to Iron Man, and before that, the band Force. So there you go. You should go and get all of this shit if you like doom metal. If you have like any taste at all, I don't know, man. If you're the kind of metalhead that wasn't into any of that, I don't even know really what kind of metalhead you are. Anyways, hope you enjoyed learning all that, and I'll see you next time for the conclusion to the Gargoyle Saga.
Better not clink that bottle, boy.